The night Eleanor Hartley left Ashmore House, snow had not yet fallen. The drive was still dark, the gravel pale as chalk in the moonlight, and the great front door stood behind her like a closed argument. She held a letter in one gloved hand, the paper folded 3 times the way her father had always folded his correspondence, and she did not look back. She had told herself she would not. She had been telling herself many things in the weeks since the midsummer dinner, and the practice of it had worn her thin as old linen. She had not yet taken 3 steps down the drive when she heard the door open again. She had not been afraid of much in her 23 years. She had been afraid of that sound. To understand why, it is necessary to begin some months earlier. In a spring that had arrived with the particular cruelty London reserved for women with no address of their own. Eleanor had come to Ashmore House in April, by way of a solicitor's letter and a cousin's impatience. Her father, Mr. Aldous Hartley of Summerfield, had died in February, leaving behind £300 of debt, a modest library he had loved past reason, and a daughter he had perhaps loved too quietly to be useful. The Summerfield estate passed, as it had always been fated to pass under its entail, to a male cousin who had the grace to express regret and the efficiency to set a date for her departure. He gave her 6 weeks and a letter of introduction, as though she were a parcel requiring forwarding. The solicitor found her a position. Lady Dorothea Wentworth, Dowager Duchess of Ashmore, required a companion for the London season, a woman of good family and quiet disposition who would not require explanation at a dinner table, but would not require notice either. The wage was £28 per annum, which would not address her father's debt in any year she could calculate without grief, but which would keep her fed and housed inside walls that did not belong to the impatient cousin. Eleanor arrived at Ashmore House on a Tuesday morning with 1 trunk and the folded letter her father had pressed into her hands 2 months before his final decline, when he had still been able to hold a pen. She had not opened it. She carried it in the pocket of her plainest gown, a dress of gray wool that was neat and precise, and entirely without the kind of ornament the season would observe. She was not unbeautiful. She had cheekbones her father had called fine, and eyes the color of the sea in October, a gray that shifted between storms. The London season had decided not to notice any of it. The Dowager received her in the yellow drawing-room, with the measured efficiency of a woman long accustomed to acquiring and dispensing useful objects. Lady Dorothea was perhaps 60, dressed in lavender silk with diamonds at her throat, that caught the morning light and gave back nothing. She assessed Eleanor in 3 seconds and arrived at her conclusion before Eleanor had finished her curtsy. "You will do," the Dowager said. "You are quiet. Companions who talk too much are a particular trial. My son is in residence for the present, and he does not tolerate noise." The son in question was James Wentworth, the Duke of Ashmore, and Eleanor had been informed of his existence in the abstract manner one is informed of the weather. Important, unavoidable, and not a subject for personal feeling. She had seen him once, at a distance, on her second morning, crossing the courtyard below her window in riding clothes, his face turned toward the stable block with the expression of a man who found the horses more restful than anything inside. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than the fashionable ideal, with dark hair and a jaw that the morning light made severe. He moved as though a great portion of his attention was always engaged elsewhere. The first dismissal came 2 days later, in front of Mrs. Pennington, the Dowager's old friend, and a Miss Cecily Frome, who arrived with her mother at 11 o'clock for what the Dowager termed a morning call, and which Eleanor understood, within 5 minutes, to be an inspection. Cecily Frome was everything the season had decided to admire. She was 20, fair-haired, possessed of a laugh that rang like coins in a dish, and she wore a carriage dress of pale blue that had clearly cost more than Eleanor's annual wage. Her mother arranged her in the window seat with practiced ease, the light falling on her daughter's profile at its most becoming angle. The dowager watched Cecily with the expression of a woman checking the quality of a purchase she intended to make on someone else's behalf. When Eleanor brought in the correspondence tray, Mrs. Pennington glanced at her and said to the dowager, with the casual candor of old friends, "And this is your companion? She is very plain." "She is quiet," the dowager said, which was not a correction. "Miss Hartley is the companion, nothing more. She answers my correspondence and attends me at such functions as require a second woman of good family. You need not concern yourself with her. Miss Hartley is the companion, nothing more." The words arrived in Eleanor's chest with the physical precision of a key turning in a lock. She set the tray down. She did not alter her face. She had been practicing that too. The season opened properly with a ball at Viscount Pembury's house in early May, and Eleanor attended in her capacity as the dowager's shadow, which meant she stood where she was placed, held whatever she was given, and occupied the chair nearest the wall with the patience of a woman who has discovered that patience is the only currency available to her. She was holding the dowager's evening shawl when the Duke of Ashmore arrived. He did not arrive the way other men arrived, with the faint theatrical awareness of their own entrance. He arrived with a complete absence of performance, crossing the room toward his mother with the unhurried directness of someone who had already assessed every other person present and found the assessment unremarkable. He spoke to the dowager briefly. He acknowledged Cecily Frome with a bow that was correct in every particular and warm in none. Then he turned, and his gaze moved across the room in that unhurried sweep. And it stopped. It stopped on Eleanor. It did not stop for long. A moment? Perhaps two. The kind of pause that might mean anything or nothing, and which Eleanor recorded without interpretation, because her wound had taught her that to interpret is to hope. And to hope inside Ashmore House was a particular form of foolishness. He was probably noting her position relative to his mother. He was probably calculating some domestic logistics she was not privy to. He was probably doing any of a dozen things that had nothing to do with a gray-eyed woman in a plain gown who held an evening shawl and occupied the chair nearest the wall. She looked away first. This was correct behavior for a companion, and Eleanor had become very practiced at correct behavior. Across the room, Cecily Frome's mother murmured something to the dowager, and both women smiled, and the evening settled back into its proper channels. What Eleanor did not yet know was that the Duke had not looked away nearly as quickly as she had. She discovered the error in the household accounts on a Thursday evening in late May, when the house was quiet and the dowager had retired early with a headache, and Eleanor had been given the household ledgers to review for a quarterly correspondence her employer refused to manage personally. The error was not small. Someone, through either carelessness or haste, had recorded a quarterly payment from old Thomas Binney, the pensioned groom who had served the Ashmore stables for 31 years, as having been missed for the second consecutive quarter. A note in a different hand at the bottom of the page read, "To be reviewed for dismissal." Eleanor sat with the page for a long moment, the single candle on the writing table throwing unsteady light across the figures. Thomas Binney was 64 years old and had no family in London. She had met him twice, both times in the stable yard, and he had touched his hat to her with the particular dignity of a man who understood his own smallness in a house of this size and had made a separate peace with it. The payment had been made. She found the corresponding entry in the preceding volume, recorded in a different column by the quarterly steward's assistant, cross-referenced to a page number that someone had copied incorrectly. The error was legible and fixable, and would take her another 40 minutes to trace through the supporting records completely, which was 40 minutes past the point at which the dowager would expect her to have retired. Eleanor worked through the 40 minutes. She corrected the entry, cross-referenced it precisely, and wrote a clear note in the margin in her own hand, identifying the column error so that it could be properly reviewed by whoever managed the steward's records in daylight. She did not know that the door to the corridor had been opened 3 inches for the better part of an hour, or that the Duke of Ashmore, returning late from his club and unable to sleep, had paused in that corridor when he saw the candlelight under the door, and had stood with one hand against the doorframe, watching a woman in a gray wool gown work through a column of figures, with the concentrated patience of someone for whom accuracy was not a professional obligation, but a moral one. She did not know that he had watched her turn back 3 pages, and then 5, and then write her corrected note with the deliberate care of a person who expected no credit for the work. She did not know any of it. She gathered her things, extinguished the candle, and went quietly to bed. The following morning, the steward received a note in the Duke's hand instructing him to review the pensioned staff records and correct all outstanding column errors before the end of the week. Thomas Binney's quarterly payment was confirmed in full. The note containing the recommendation for his dismissal was destroyed. Eleanor learned none of this. She was attending the dowager at a morning call on the other side of Mayfair, and thinking, with the small private discipline she applied to everything, about the distance between £28 per annum and £300 of debt, and what the mathematics of it meant for the next several years of her life. The Duke was sitting in the library when she returned. She had not known he would be there. She had come for a volume of the estate correspondence the dowager had asked her to retrieve, and she opened the door and found him at the desk by the window with a letter in his hand that he was not reading. He was looking at the window instead, at the garden beyond it, with the expression she had come to recognize as his resting face, still as a weather vane in the absence of wind, pointed at nothing in particular, carrying everything. He turned when she entered. "Miss Hartley." "Your Grace, I beg your pardon." Lady Dorothea required the Summerfield correspondence file. She moved toward the shelves along the east wall, keeping her path orderly and her face composed. "I will be a moment only. Take as long as you require." He set the letter down. He did not return to the window. "You were in the accounts room last night." She turned from the shelves with the file in her hands and met his gaze with the steadiness of someone who had nothing to hide and no particular expectation of being seen. "I was. I found an error in the quarterly ledger that required correction. I hope I did not disturb the house." "You did not disturb the house." He paused, a moment of the kind she had learned to measure in terms of what was not being said. "Thomas Binney has been with this estate since my father was alive." "Yes," she said. "The error was a column reference, not a payment default. I noted it clearly." He looked at her. The look lasted longer than was strictly required by the conversation, and she felt it the way one feels a change in the temperature of a room. Not dramatically, but in the body, before the mind has named the cause. "The file you need is on the second shelf from the bottom," he said, "behind the Summerfield correspondence. My father reorganized the library in 1809, and it has not been righted since." She found the file where he said it would be. She thanked him. She left the room with her composure intact, and only in the corridor did she permit herself to notice that her heartbeat had shifted somewhere between the shelves and the door. She did not allow herself to name what she had noticed. There had been another person before her in this house who had occupied a space near James Wentworth and had been noticed by him, and that person had died. She knew this the way she knew most things at Ashmore House. By inference, by the objects left in place, by the way the dowager would sometimes look toward a certain portrait in the upper corridor, and then look away with the careful movement of someone protecting a bruise. The late Duchess had been called Anne. There was a miniature in a silver frame that Eleanor had seen once on the Duke's writing desk, lying face down in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately rather than fallen. She understood, looking at that miniature, that the coldness she had attributed to his rank was something else entirely. She understood it the way she understood her father's silence in his last months. Not as absence, but as the form grief takes when a person has decided to keep it from becoming a burden on those nearby. She had not expected to understand him. Understanding him was not useful. And yet it happened. It happened in small increments, the way a tide rises on a flat beach, almost imperceptibly, until the ground underfoot is no longer dry. He began to speak to her when they were in the same room. Not at length, not warmly, in the sense of performed warmth, but with a directness that she came to recognize as his version of it. Short sentences, questions that had no frivolous purpose. When the house party in late June required her to be present at a garden luncheon she was not dressed for, he said, without preface or explanation, "Come inside," and led her out of the direct sun before her headache had become something she would need to mention. She had not mentioned it. He had noticed anyway. At the garden gate one evening, returning from a walk she had taken alone in the hour before dinner, she nearly collided with him coming the other way. His hand steadied her elbow. The contact lasted 2 seconds, and he withdrew immediately, with the controlled precision of a man who understood exactly what his own hands were doing, and said, "The latch sticks. I should have had it seen to." "It is nothing," she said. "The gravel is uneven on this side as well." He released her elbow. He did not move to pass through the gate. She was still standing in the opening. "Are you warm enough?" She was not, and they both knew it, and he did not press the point, but he walked back toward the house at a pace calibrated to hers without appearing to have noticed that he had adjusted it. She had been telling herself, through all of this, that she was reading the situation incorrectly. She had a specific wound in her, delivered over years and sharpened by recent events. The wound that told her she was forgettable, that she was a problem awaiting reassignment, that whatever small accommodations the world occasionally offered her were functions of convenience rather than recognition. The wound spoke fluently and with great authority, and she had no reliable counter-evidence. The midsummer dinner provided evidence of the other kind. There were 40 guests at the Ashmore midsummer dinner, and the table was set with the dowager's full silver service, and Cecily Frome was seated at the Duke's right hand in a gown of white and gold that had clearly been commissioned for this occasion. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table, between a retired general who was hard of hearing and a clergyman who preferred his own thoughts to conversation, and she ate her soup and spoke when spoken to and watched, from a careful distance, the way Cecily arranged herself within the Duke's orbit with the practiced ease of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was the correct answer to every relevant question. It was the dowager who spoke, during the remove between the fish and the roast, in a voice pitched to carry to perhaps 6 guests on either side, which was enough. "My son has been long enough without guidance in his own house," Lady Dorothea said, with the satisfied composure of someone placing the final figure in a completed equation. "Miss Frome's family and ours have been neighbors in Wiltshire for 3 generations. It seems to me the most natural thing in the world that this arrangement should be formalized before the autumn." She did not say engagement. She did not need to. The table heard it exactly as she had intended. Cecily lowered her eyes with the practiced modesty of someone who had rehearsed the expression. The Duke sat very still. Eleanor looked at the centerpiece. It was a spray of white roses and trailing fern, and she looked at it with the complete attention of a woman who needs an object to prevent her face from becoming information. She did not look at the Duke. She did not, therefore, see the expression on his face, which was not the expression of a man receiving a welcome announcement. She carried the conclusion she had drawn from the dowager's words back to her room that night, and placed it alongside the other conclusions she had been carefully constructing since April, and they all pointed in the same direction. The hierarchy had spoken its final word. She was the companion. Nothing more. She had always been the companion. Nothing more. And she had been a particular kind of fool to feel the garden gate and the library and the adjusted walking pace as anything other than the ordinary courtesies of a man with good manners and a habit of noticing small discomforts in the people around him. She began to write her departure letter that same evening. She wrote slowly and carefully, because she had her father's instinct for precision, and because she did not want anything in it to read as complaint. She thanked the dowager for the position. She cited a personal matter requiring her return to her own county, which was near enough to true. She said she would arrange for her trunk by the end of the week and would ensure the household records were left in complete order. She did not write a word to the Duke. She folded the letter the morning after, in the gray light before the household rose, and tucked it into her coat pocket, where it sat alongside the unread letter from her father. 2 folded papers. Her whole inheritance. She was at the front door, with her coat buttoned and her gloves on and her small valise at her feet, when she heard the door to the upper corridor open. She heard his step on the stair. She knew his step by then, though she had not intended to learn it. Miss Hartley. She did not turn immediately. The latch of the front door was in her hand. She could have opened it. She had been very carefully not hoping for things, and this, she told herself, was not hope. This was the delay of a person with good manners. She turned. He was at the foot of the stairs, still in his coat as though he too had not been asleep, holding her letter in one hand. His face was set in its usual discipline, but there was something different in it. Something she had no name for yet. A quality of a man who has been very certain about a course of action and has now been interrupted by a fact that requires him to reconsider. "You wrote this at 3 a.m, he said. "I had difficulty sleeping. I found it slid under the study door." He came across the hall toward her, not quickly, not slowly. "You have written that you have a personal matter in your own county." "Yes. You have no family in your own county. Your cousin has the house." She had not expected him to know that. She had not expected him to know much about her circumstances in any specific way, and the realization that he did know them produced a sensation at the base of her throat that she recognized as the precursor to something she could not afford. She kept her hands at her sides, her grip on the valise strap steady. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I believe the position has run its natural course. My mother announced an engagement that has not been offered, and will not be." He said this with the level precision of a man reading a weather report, plain, factual, concerning only the truth of the matter. "The arrangement is not proceeding. I should have said so sooner. I did not." He paused. "That was a failure of directness for which I owe you, specifically, an account." She had no prepared response for this. Her wound offered several, all of them deflections. She used none of them. "I am not leaving because of Miss Frome," she said, which was true. She was leaving because staying had become a thing she could no longer do with any remaining sense of self-possession, and she was too proud to say that aloud. Then why? It was not quite a question. It had the shape of one, but none of the uncertainty. She looked at him. His eyes were the color she had eventually decided was gray-green, though they changed with the light, and in the dark hall at this hour, they were simply dark, and intent, and fixed on her face with a quality of attention she had been refusing to believe for months. "Because," she said very precisely, "I am not particularly skilled at remaining in a room where I am not required." He was quiet for a moment. The hall was cold and still, and the candle on the side table threw its unsteady light across the half of his face nearest her. "You have been required," he said. "From the first evening I found you working through a ledger to save a man's position, when no one would have known if you had left the error standing. You were not required to do it. You did it. That is not the behavior of a woman who occupies a room as a convenience." She held herself very still. "Come to the Pembury Assembly Friday next," he said. "Come as yourself, not as my mother's companion. Come as Miss Eleanor Hartley of Summerfield, whose father taught her to read a column of figures, and who corrects errors at 3 a.m. on behalf of men she barely knows. Come, and let me be equally precise in public." She was quiet for a long moment. The valise was still in her hand. The letter was in his. "Your Grace," she said finally, "I have been wrong about a great many things in this house. I would rather not be wrong about this. You are not wrong about this." He said it quietly. He did not embellish it. "Will you come?" She set the valise down. The Pembury Assembly on the Friday evening was the season's last formal gathering before the summer exodus to country houses, and the room was full with the particular density of a crowd that knows it will not gather again in this configuration until October. The Dowager was present, seated near the wall with Cecily Frome's mother on one side and the efficient blankness of a woman awaiting an outcome on her face. Cecily herself was near the center of the room in rose-colored silk, surrounded by her usual admirers, still operating on the assumption that the midsummer announcement had been something more than her sponsor's optimism. Eleanor arrived in a gown that was not new, but that was hers, a pale blue-gray that she had kept from her father's house, the color of October sea, with her hair arranged by no one's hand, but her own. She entered on no one's arm. She found a position near the east wall and stood quietly, and the room's familiar eyes moved across her and found her unremarkable, which was the ordinary verdict, and she allowed it. She had done nothing wrong in her life. She reminded herself of this, which was not self-pity, but fact. The Duke arrived 20 minutes after the hour, and the room did what it always did when he arrived. It rearranged itself slightly around him, the way a current shifts around a fixed point. He spoke briefly to Lord Pembury. He declined the offered card table. He turned with the deliberate, unhurried quality that she now understood was never inattention, but always its opposite, and his gaze found her across the full width of the room. He crossed it in 3 strides. This was not, as a matter of purely physical fact, a great number of strides. The room was wide. 3 strides was therefore faster than was quite natural, faster than the measured pace of a man performing a social obligation, fast in a way that the room noticed, because the room noticed everything, and because the Duke of Ashmore had not crossed a room at that pace toward any woman since his wife had been alive to cross rooms toward. He stopped before her and offered his hand. Not for a dance, simply as itself. His hand extended, palm up, in a room full of witnesses. "Miss Hartley," he said, at a volume that carried with perfect clarity to the dozen people nearest them, and outward from there in concentric rings of comprehension as the assembly understood what it was seeing. "Will you honor me?" He did not say with a dance. He did not qualify it. The sentence stood as its own complete statement, and the room read it correctly. Eleanor took his hand. If you have found yourself holding your breath through this story, leave a word in the comments for Eleanor. She has earned the witness. She felt his fingers close around hers with the contained steadiness of a man who had made up his mind and would not be revising the decision. And she permitted herself, for the first time in this house and this season, to believe what she was seeing. The dowager, seated near the wall, understood what had happened in the same moment that the room did. One could see it in the quality of her stillness, which changed from the stillness of confident waiting to the stillness of a woman recalibrating a calculation she had believed settled. She did not stand. She did not speak. Cecily's mother leaned toward her and said something in an undertone, and the dowager replied with a single short sentence that carried no volume, and that was all. The correction was quiet and complete. Cecily looked once toward the center of the room, and her expression held a brief, unguarded moment of recognition. And then she turned back to her circle and took a glass of wine from the tray of a passing footman, and the field was vacated without drama and without cruelty. The Duke did not release Eleanor's hand for some time. They stood in the assembly room with the crowd reforming around them into new configurations, and the music continued, and somewhere behind them, Lord Pembury said something to his wife that made her laugh, and Eleanor was present for all of it with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything. Fully, specifically, without reservation. "You said you would be precise," she said quietly, when the immediate crowd had shifted enough to give them a private inch. "I have been, for once in my life, entirely precise," he said. They were married in September, at the small church in the Ashmore village, with the vicar who had christened the Duke's father, and who had never, in 40 years of performing the rite, officiated at a union that appeared to him less ambiguous in its purpose. There were no elaborate celebrations planned. The dowager attended with the careful composure of a woman who had reorganized her understanding of certain things and intended to carry herself with dignity through the reorganization. She kissed Eleanor's cheek in the vestibule afterward, briefly and firmly, which was not warmth but was something more useful: acknowledgement. Ashmore House received them back in the late afternoon, with the house staff arranged in the courtyard as tradition required. Thomas Binney stood at the end of the line, his hat in his hands, and his face carrying the expression of a man who had outlasted several predictions about his future. He nodded at Eleanor as she passed, once with deliberate recognition, and she understood that some accounts are settled in glances rather than words. The snow came in November, earlier than the season usually allowed, beginning on a Wednesday afternoon as a light fall and deepening through the evening into something that muffled the whole estate into a particular quality of quiet. Eleanor was in the sitting room that had been reassigned to her use, the fire well established and the room properly warm, when she finally opened her father's letter. She had carried it for 9 months, through the death of her old life and the beginning of this one. And she had not opened it, because she had been afraid of what it might say, and more afraid of what it might not. Her father had been a quiet man who understood things he rarely named aloud, and she had not known, until the last, whether he had understood her. The letter was 3 pages in his careful hand. The pen strokes slightly unsteady from the illness, but legible, entirely legible. Every word. He told her that she had never been invisible to him. He told her that he had watched her learn to make herself quiet in rooms that required it, and had grieved, privately, that he had not been able to give her a world where she did not need that particular skill. He told her that the world's failure to see clearly was a failure of the world, and not of her, and that he expected she would find, in time, someone with the patience and the clarity to see what he had always seen. A person whose worth was the kind that required no performance, only observation. He told her to be patient. He told her she was worth waiting for. She read it twice in the firelight. Then she folded it along its original creases and crossed the room to the mantel, where she set it upright against the base of the candlestick, the way one places a thing intended to remain. James came in when the fire had settled into its low, steady burning, and the snow outside was still falling on the gravel and the garden and the stable yard, where Thomas Binney's lantern was the only light still moving in the dark. He brought a second candle and set it on the table without asking whether she needed it, because she probably did. And then he stood near the mantel and looked at the letter standing upright against the candlestick. "From your father," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. In his coat pocket, she knew, was the miniature of Anne, as it had been every day since the woman's death 3 years before. He had told Eleanor about Anne in September, on the evening before the wedding, in a very short account delivered in the same level factual voice he brought to all things that cost him greatly. Anne had died in childbed, the child with her, in the winter of 1817, and he had carried the grief in the only way he knew, which was to place it where it would not damage the people around him. Turned face down on the writing desk of his daily life. He reached now into his coat pocket and brought out the miniature. He held it for a moment. Then he set it on the mantel beside the letter and turned the small silver frame upright. Anne's face was fine-featured and composed in the way of miniatures. The painted eyes lighter than any real eye in any real light. Eleanor looked at it without jealousy and without inadequacy, because she had not been chosen in place of Anne. She had been chosen by a man who had learned, through loss and through the slow, patient work of grief, what it meant to see clearly, and at what cost a person withheld the act of seeing from themselves. The snow was thick on the window now, pressing its weight against the glass. She did not need to say anything. He knew and she knew, and the room held the knowledge the way rooms hold the warmth of a good fire, without announcement, simply as the quality of the air. Outside, the whole drive was white. Inside, the letter stood against the candlestick, and the miniature stood beside it, and the fire moved in its ordinary small patterns, and Eleanor Hartley, who had become in September the mistress of Ashmore, and in November the keeper of one particular room whose fire no one allowed to go out, sat in the chair nearest the hearth and felt, without drama, without proclamation, the steady, unhurried warmth of a world that had finally got her name right.